4 Steptoe & Son videos, each containing 3 episodes, are now available from retailers.
Baldrick, where's the manuscript?
You mean the big papery thing tied up with string?
Yes, Baldrick, the manuscript belonging to Dr. Johnson.
You mean the Beatty fellow in the black coat who just left?
Yes, Baldrick, Dr. Johnson.
So you're asking where the big papery thing tied up with string belonging to the Beatty fellow in the black coat who just left is?
Yes, Baldrick, I am. And if you don't answer, then the booted bony thing with 5 toes on the end of my leg will soon connect sharply with the soft, dangly collection of objects in your hand. For the last time, Baldrick, where is Dr. Johnson's manuscript?
On the fire.
What?
The hot orangey thing under the stony mantelpiece.
And starting on 2 shortly, more comedy sketches and music in naked video. Here on 1, in Alan Bennett's Talking Heads, Stephanie Cole, as a stockbroker's widow, finds life stripping her of most of her assets. That's in half an hour.
The 9 o'clock news from the BBC with Martin Lewis and Andrew Harvey.
Mr. Gorbachev says his reforms have created real turmoil at all levels of Soviet society.
The Polish shipyard workers are defeated. They vote to end their strike.
Back in South Africa, Zola Budd out of the running for the Olympics.
Conservative MPs warn the Environment Secretary not to embark on wholesale violation of the Green Belt.
And the earthquake written in the stars. Thousands of Californians take to the hills. Good evening. The Soviet leader, Mr. Gorbachev, has given his first real indication of the amount of opposition to his economic reform program. In a strongly worded speech to newspaper editors last Saturday, but only just published tonight by the Soviet news agency TASS, he said many Communist Party members, from the workers right up to the highest levels, were not prepared to implement his policies. There was real turmoil in their minds, panic which had reached such a level as to question whether the stability of their socialist society was at stake. But, he said, that was because people were confused, and he repeated his determination to pursue his policies and root out negative influences. We've just received this report from Brian Hanrahan in Moscow.
It's difficult to know if Mr. Gorbachev intends his speech to be alarmist or reassuring. With the quarrels within the Communist Party breaking out in public, the Soviet leader warns against branding some people enemies of perestroika. But he admits his policies are causing turmoil in the minds of many people, even at the top level. And he goes on, the panic has reached such a level as to question whether perestroika is something destructive. On recent public occasions, Mr. Gorbachev has gone out of his way to be friendly to the man credited with doing the questioning, his deputy Igor Ligachev. But even if rumors of a split in the Kremlin seem over-exaggerated, there's undoubtedly serious opposition to his policies, which will come to a head at the party conference in 6 weeks' time. Mr. Gorbachev revealed tonight that the conference will have the same number of delegates as a full party congress. A hint it will also have the same powers to create policy and to change leadership posts. The reformers want the conference to spur on perestroika, but with a stagnant economy, falling food supplies, and growing public grumbles, the Conservatives may want to block any more of Mr. Gorbachev's ideas. This is Brian Hanrahan for the 9 o'clock news in Moscow.
Polish workers have ended their occupation of the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk. It was taken over on May the 2nd by supporters of Solidarity. But tonight, in the face of dwindling support and pressure from the authorities, they called off the strike.
A fortnight after the start of the latest confrontation between Solidarity and the Polish government, the men in the Lenin shipyard were the last ones still holding out. They'd been on strike for 9 days. But it had been clear for some time that support inside and outside the yard was waning, and also that the government wasn't going to give in to their political demands. The authorities offered more money, but they said they'd never agree to legalise Solidarity. The strikers, including the union's chairman Lech Walesa, had repeatedly turned down pay offers and other concessions, the legalisation of solidarity was at the core of the strike. The police cut off supplies of food, clothes and medicine as they kept the Lenin shipyard under virtual siege. Even so, morale apparently remained high right up to the end. But when calls for fresh nationwide action to support the strikers brought no response, the men still inside the shipyard had little alternative but to end their protest. The government had announced earlier that they were backing away from their emergency plans to ban all strikes and send organisers to prison, but it's clear that the strikes ended without any agreement.
The Soviet and American foreign ministers meet in Geneva tomorrow to try to iron out problems delaying ratification of the arms deal signed in Washington last December. American senators have postponed their debate on the INF Treaty indefinitely. They're worried that the proposals to prevent cheating aren't strict enough.
In the Senate, where the treaty has to be ratified, senators were holding back today, wondering whether they had a deal at all.
And I would say there are a lot of balls in the air on this in terms of the Senate, but I believe we all agree that the INF Treaty is the priority when we resolve these problems.
But congressional leaders who briefed the president were not yet sounding a note of alarm.
We're hopeful it will be ready. We're optimistic that that will happen.
I think that there is goodwill in a bipartisan way to see the INF Treaty ratified. I think there are problems, but the Soviets, after all, in our judgment, want to have a treaty. We want to have a treaty. It seems to me there are things to be clarified as opposed to a great deal of argumentation that's insoluble.
For once, there's no division between White House and Congress or between the parties. They all want the treaty, and at a ceremony for the outgoing NATO Secretary-General, Lord Carrington seemed to be urging ratification.
And we have in the INF Treaty an historic agreement, and that in itself may hold out the promise of even better things to come.
In the American view, the problems raised could be just low-level obstruction on the Soviet side and could easily be got out of the way by Mr. Shevardnadze in his talks with Mr. Schultz this week. According to the Americans, as so often, it's up to Moscow. This is Martin Bell for the 9 o'clock news at the White House.
The Soviet Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze arrived in Geneva this afternoon for the final meeting with his American counterpart before the Moscow summit. His reaction to the senator's announcement: "I thought there was no problem." The Russians have long been straining to show how they're ready for the deal, withdrawing missiles even before the treaties come into effect. But the American senators object to the deal on about 10 counts. They want a rule against any as yet undeveloped types of warheads being deployed on missiles banned by the treaty. And they want to clarify the rules on the equipment, like cameras, inspectors will be allowed. But their most serious objection is over access to the Soviet SS-20s. They say the Russians will only allow inspections of fully assembled SS-20s, but not of its separated stages. The Americans are worried because the SS-20's first stage looks very like that of the SS-25, a long-range missile not banned by the treaty. And without a very detailed inspection, the senators believe the Russians could cheat. The two missiles are so alike that the banned SS-20s could be deployed without detection. The two foreign ministers will tackle this and other issues when they meet tomorrow. Failure to agree then shouldn't jeopardize the treaty or the summit in Moscow at the end of the month. But it won't encourage either side to press ahead on their next and much harder task, a treaty cutting strategic nuclear weapons.
Zola Budd is back in her hometown in South Africa. She says she doesn't know if she'll ever compete in international athletics again. She also says the controversy over her links with South Africa has left her mentally exhausted. It means she'll miss this year's Olympics, but it also means the possible ban on Britain taking part has been lifted. The Sports Minister Colin Moynihan said he hoped Zola Budd would soon return to competition.
Zola Budd back at her family home in Bloemfontein. She looked relaxed and happy, despite an overnight flight, a 5-hour drive from Johannesburg, and despite the mental strain Miss Budd says forced her to leave Britain. The athlete told me she had escaped unbearable political pressures. She still insists she did nothing wrong in attending athletics meetings on her previous visits to South Africa. Miss Budd says she's written off the Olympics and admitted to being angry and bitter about what has happened.
I'm angry at the fact that I am seen as a representative of South Africa, and therefore all South Africa's problems are loaded onto my shoulders, and people see me as a political pawn.
Do you think you could have avoided some of these problems by doing what some people have asked you to do, which is to condemn apartheid publicly?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I can't condemn apartheid because I don't want to allow, or don't want to make any public political statement.
Do you think people will exploit the fact that you've come back and use it against you?
As they've done in the past, they will probably again, yes.
Now Miss Budd says she must face the most crucial decision of her career alone, whether to stay here in South Africa or to fight her way back into world-class athletics and renewed controversy. This is James Robbins for the 9 o'clock news in Bloemfontein.
The farmer's daughter from Bloemfontein, frail, barefoot, was a potential world beater in her mid-teens. But South Africa's isolation from world sport left her quietly untested in international competition. The Daily Mail changed that. The newspaper brought her to England in March 1984, and she quickly received British citizenship. But with the publicity came the controversy as protesters singled her out as a symbol of apartheid. At first, the demonstrations had little effect on her performance. She fulfilled all her promise, breaking records on the way. But the deepening controversies over her continuing links with South Africa did eventually disturb her form and her health. Her alleged participation in meetings in South Africa and the high-level investigations proved too much.
When I saw her, she was crying, she was very anxious, she was very upset, she had headaches, her pulse rate was raised, she clearly hadn't slept well for several nights, so she was very tired and exhausted.
It's sad that she's had to suffer in the way that she has, but I think the Olympic Games are back on course. I think the British athletes will be there. They'll be there without Zola Budd, but one only hopes that in the long term that she comes out of this reasonably well as can be expected, and that she'll be back running again, and hopefully for Great Britain as well.
The anti-apartheid groups believe that Zola Budd could run for Britain again, but only under certain conditions.
Firstly, she has to prove herself to be a Briton. She has to remain in this country long enough not to cause provocations and problems internationally. And if these particular conditions are met, we will have no objections to Zola Budd participating in international competitions.
The Gleneagles Agreement of 1977 was drawn up to outlaw all significant sporting contacts with South Africa. The Commonwealth countries accepted that each country would determine its own methods to do this. In rugby, for example, the English national team who leave tonight for Australia could not visit South Africa. But if individuals want to go, then the choice is theirs. But some British athletics officials believe the Zola Budd affair shows that further clarification on sporting contacts is necessary.
Somebody's got to sit down and say, what can people do in South Africa, anything at all, and lay it down hard on the line so that people like Zola Budd know exactly what they can or cannot do when they go back to South Africa.
A redefinition of the rules may help Zola Budd sometime in the future, but for now, her ambitions as an Olympic competitor lie in ruins.
The Environment Secretary, Nicholas Ridley, has tonight tried to calm fears among Conservative backbenchers about plans for more housing development in the southeast of England. He insisted that the Green Belt would not be threatened. But some of the 80 Tories, worried about the government's approach, have called again for tighter controls on property developers.
The problem is created by the enormous pressure for more houses to be built in the southeast. It's estimated 1 million more homes will be needed before the year 2000. And tonight, Mr. Ridley said, if the government didn't recognise the need for more houses on new sites, future generations would suffer. It's not that the population in the southeast is growing. It's largely social factors producing the housing pressure. There are more divorces, people are marrying later, and there are more pensioners. As a result, more homes are needed. Mr. Ridley denies that he's threatening the Green Belt.
I've reiterated for about the 1000th time that we are sticking firmly to our Green Belt policy. There have been no breaches of it since I've been in charge, and there will be none.
The former Conservative Environment Secretary, Michael Heseltine, recently acted as a television reporter to promote his campaign against what he sees as the threat of overdevelopment. A planned new town encroaching a village in Oxfordshire was one of his targets.
It can't be right in the congested southeast to add to that congestion by putting 6,000 houses on over 1,000 acres of land.
At Westminster this evening, some of the 80 Tories who formed an action group showed they weren't mollified by Mr. Ridley's speech.
my Conservative council rejected an application for the development of 3,500 houses, and the Secretary of State allowed it on appeal. Now, I mean, I'm all in favour of some development within the Green Belt, but we really are becoming increasingly concerned that far too much of it is being permitted by Mr. Ridley on appeal.
It seems that despite Mr. Ridley's attempts to calm fears about eroding the Green Belt, many of his own supporters aren't convinced. And it's particularly in Conservative areas that the pressure is most intense to open up new sites and to build more houses.
Lorry drivers have tightened their blockade of the main channel ports. They say they'll continue until there's an end to the disruption caused by the Siemens dispute with P&O. Today, the company firmly refused the union's request for further negotiations. The union is still discussing its next move at TUC headquarters in London. Some 800 lorries are now blocking roads in and around Dover, and the French ports of Dunkirk and Calais are also closed. Peter Main reports.
The lorry drivers at Calais were the first to take action, and today they voted overwhelmingly to continue their blockade. They're now calling on drivers at Cherbourg, Le Havre and Caen to join them. Most of the British holidaymakers stranded in Calais by the protest have now managed to get home. But this woman and her 2-month-old baby are still waiting for a place on a hovercraft. With nowhere else to stay, a driver let them spend last night in his lorry cab. Along the coast at Dunkirk, it's the same story. Hundreds of lorries are blockading the port entrance and no sign of the drivers giving in. After meeting Sea-Link and P&O officials, lorry drivers at Dover also voted to continue their protest.
We'll sit it out till next week. We'll sit out for a month if we got to. We'll sit here without wages. If we got to, we will do it, to make our conditions better.
With some of the hundreds of lorries on the dockside blocking the loading ramps, the main ferry terminal is still closed, and port officials admit there's nothing they can do.
It's a very real question as to whether it is practicable to move 350 lorries. And there is little point in promoting a major confrontation, even a public order problem. There's quite enough confrontation in this dispute already without provoking any more.
Some Belgian and French crude ferries have been carrying just passengers, no cars or freight, into the western docks. But the hovercraft and jet foils are the only cross-channel services running normally to and from Dover.
At the TUC tonight, NUS leaders and delegates from all Britain's ferry ports have been continuing discussions on how to refocus the dispute back on P&O. They've been trying to secure the reinstatement of NUS members round the country sacked for taking sympathy action over P&O. And, more importantly, whether to pick up Sea-Link's offer to employ 450 of the P&O strikers at Dover. If the offer is accepted, it opens the way for the NUS to regain control of their union from the sequestrator. Sam McCluskey, the NUS General Secretary, is confident a deal will eventually be made, but the length of time it's taking implies that he's meeting some opposition.
The Electricians' Union has refused to accept 2 directives to conform with TUC policy, a move which could lead to its expulsion from the organisation. The union's leader, Eric Hammond, says he won't scrap single union agreements and he won't accept TUC censure for the union's actions during the Wapping dispute. He's to ballot his members on a rule change.
4 more cases of Legionnaire's disease have been confirmed, bringing the total to 24. 7 people are seriously ill. The outbreak started at the BBC headquarters in central London. Public health officials say there's no more danger of infection.
A 3-month trial involving 11 men accused of soccer violence ended abruptly this morning, with all of them being cleared on the direction of the judge. He told the jury that prosecution evidence appeared to have been fabricated. The 11 were alleged to have belonged to a gang called the Intercity Firm, who engaged in a 6-year campaign of violence. But in court in East London, Judge Alan Hitchings ordered the acquittals after being told by the prosecution that doubt had been cast on entries in police notebooks which had been used in evidence against the men.
The new Prime Minister of France is Michel Rocard. He's a moderate socialist, and he takes over from the Conservative Jacques Chirac, who was defeated in Sunday's election.
An unrepentant group of Chirac supporters set up a cheer in the street outside, and then the most painful 10 minutes of Monsieur Chirac's political career were about to begin. The smile seemed more fixed than ever. Both Monsieur Mitterrand and Monsieur Chirac might have preferred to avoid a face-to-face meeting. but the French constitution insists that the act of resigning has to be done like this. And then it was over, and so finally was the awkward political experiment by which Monsieur Chirac, the Conservative, had served as Prime Minister to a Socialist President. It was a gamble which probably cost him the election. Soon afterwards, the announcement was made about his successor. The President had appointed Michel Rocard to take his place. Michel Rocard is very much a right-wing socialist, a man who once challenged Monsieur Mitterrand himself for the leadership of the party in the hope of turning it more towards the centre. By appointing him Prime Minister, President Mitterrand has done much the same thing, opened his government even to liberal conservatives. This evening, on the steps of the Prime Minister's office, the old occupant and the new said goodbye to each other. The adventurous, high-risk regime of Monsieur Chirac is over. A more cautious one has begun. This is John Simpson for the 9 o'clock news in Paris.
The Labour Party is making far-reaching changes in its economic strategy. After a two-day meeting, it's adopted suggestions made by one of the policy review committees set up after last year's general election. The changes include new ideas on public ownership with the creation of what are called public interest companies.
Labour wants to avoid an ideological battle with the new shareholders of Mrs Thatcher's privatised companies. But in utilities like water, gas, electricity and telecommunications, they want to protect national and consumers' interests as well.
The purpose of the document is to show that the Labour Party has looked forwards, is not wedded to old divisions between left and right, old labels, if you like. But we've consciously tried to think our way into the 1990s. What will Britain be like in the 1990s? What are the requirements of a successful economy? What is it that our successful competitors are doing? Where are we failing?
Proposed public interest companies would have to meet agreed performance targets. These would cover standards of service, investment and prices. They'd be enforced by stronger regulatory authorities. Labour's moving towards more flexible forms of public ownership. These would include majority or minority government shareholdings, conversion of shares into non-voting bonds and workers' cooperative and share schemes. Neil Kinnock knows elections are won on the state of the economy. His main objective in this review is to get Labour's economic plans into shape and then hope Mrs Thatcher's luck won't last. But he's leaving the tough decisions on defence till next year. By then, he thinks Washington and Moscow will have made his task easier.
Prince Harry, the second son of the Prince and Princess of Wales, is recovering at home tonight after a minor operation for a hernia. The Prince, who's 3, went into Great Ormond Street Hospital last night. Buckingham Palace said his operation had been a success.
The appeal court will rule tomorrow on whether a man who's taken refuge in a church for nearly 18 months should be deported to Sri Lanka. Viraj Mendes says that if he does go back, his life will be in danger because of his support for Tamil separatists.
A self-confessed communist, Viraj Mendes turned to the church for sanctuary. For 17 months, he's taken refuge in the Church of Ascension in Manchester and refused to come out, defying all efforts to deport him. Though a Sinhalese, he's been outspoken in pressing the case for Tamil self-determination. He says he's been seen as a traitor by the Sri Lankan government and will be killed if sent back.
For the Home Office, this case is the test case for a sanctuary movement. And they see if I'm allowed to win, right, there'll be hundreds of people who will use the same methods.